As the humanitarian crisis in Zimbabwe unfolds, the country is also battling what is a broken economy. Joining us for that conversation, financial journalist Chris Bishop, who's of course very familiar with some of the issues facing Zimbabwe. Chris, of course, when the incumbent Emmerson Mnangagwa was brought into power, or when he assumed power, there were big questions around whether or not this would mean change, especially economically, for many Zimbabweans who'd long been suppressed and who'd long been living under depression conditions. Talk to us about what the situation is today.
Well, this is case in point. I mean, nearly 3 years ago, and the man promised so much and just delivered very little. I mean, if you change the name? Unfortunately, I was looking through his speech today at, to the nation. If you look through all that stuff there, enemies within, rogue Zimbabweans working with outside agitators, all that kind of enemy within stuff, change the names, and it could have been Robert Gabriel Mugabe from 20-odd years ago when I was working there. I mean, you look at it, all this stuff about how they're holding back Zimbabwe's economic growth is actually, it's not true. I mean, the country is struggling, the country is dire for investment, infrastructure is crumbling, a lot of businesses have gone there are currency problems, and that's just the start of it. I mean, and bearing in mind that Zimbabwe, in my mind, is still a linchpin of the entire Southern African region, I think it's a time to be very worried, and I think Zimbabwe should be doing what Emmerson Mnangagwa promised to us all when we were at Davos in Switzerland a couple of years ago. He was going to turn the economy around. He was a business president. He was going to do anything in his power to get the economy kicking. And this kind of finger pointing in his speech today doesn't really chime with that.
Now, one of the things that we've seen, especially since the lockdown, is a clampdown on hawkers and people who make their trade of selling in the streets. Speak to me about how small businesses there have also been decimated by simply some of the regulations that have been put in place.
Well, I'll give you an example, a very simple example. A friend of mine who was going up there to run chickens a few years ago, and I thought, well, you can't go wrong. All you need is chicken feed and a field to put them in. And blame me, Dan, they had to shut the business because they couldn't get hold of the feed because there wasn't enough foreign currency around to do the imports. Because back, say, 20 odd years ago, you could still go to Harare, you could make things, you could buy components, you could put things together, you could get supplies. But now people tell me, even people making schools, pencils for school kids are struggling to find the wood and the raw materials to make such simple things. And it's a very great shame in the fact that its main income earner, the farming industry, which used to bring in about 70% of the entire country's earnings, has almost collapsed, the point is that there were moves this week, as you probably saw, to pay out farmers' compensation, $3.5 billion, which a lot of people are very skeptical about. I can tell you a bit more about that. But, but everyone's seeing at the moment that Matuli Ngube, the finance minister, who was talking to again this week, his heart's in the right place. He's not a political hack. He is a professional. He is an economist. He's a specialist. But how much actual impetus he's making on the economy, it remains to be seen.
Let's talk about the sanctions, because the President Emmerson Mnangagwa referenced them in his address today, and in fact said they were at the center of the crumbling of Zimbabwe's economy. Is he right?
Well, I don't think so. A lot of the sanctions were designed to hurt the elite. And the idea that they were like a way of trying to hurt the people running the country. I don't think so at this stage. I mean, then you look also, aside from sanctions, they can still do trade with China. They can still do trade with European countries, certain countries in Europe. They can still do trade with many countries, including this one. It's still the biggest trading partner, South Africa. There's a lot of things they can do. So I just think, again, like this thing about enemies within and everyone's against them and don't want to see the country succeed economically. I just think it's just political claptrap. It's just red herring, really.
When it becomes so difficult for people to be able to carry on with their daily lives, as you've been explaining so well for us about just some of the hindrances that people are experiencing, whether it's in their business or in their personal lives, what does that result in, Chris, this kind of economic situation? Does it automatically mean that the only thing left for people to do is either stay and face potential death or you leave?
Well, that's the point. I mean, there's another case in point. When I was working there, and the last days I was working there, even things weren't that great in the late 90s. There was a lot of hardships coming in. There was a lot of subsidies dropped away. There was a lot of people with a lot less money than they had before. Now, a lot of people even then used to joke about moving to South Africa. They'd never moved to South Africa. It doesn't suit them. It's not their place. They don't want to go there. And what's happened since then? I mean, like 3 to 4 million that we know of, Zimbabweans have moved to this country, and not because they wanted to, but because they're trying to look for a subsistence, for a decent life. They're trying to look for something extra. And that's almost the population of a small country in Africa. I mean, something has got to be wrong. I mean, I remember the head of the FDB, Akinwumi Adesina, telling me once that he didn't want the image of Africa to be people crossing the Mediterranean Sea in rickety boats. He didn't want that. Again, do we really want the image of people risking their lives crossing the Limpopo River to come to South Africa and come here as illegal immigrants? It's a terrible thing, and it's an awful thing. And it's something, I'll be honest with you, I first started working there back in 1994, and I would never have thought things would have come this far.
Chris, when we look at the response or lack thereof from the SADC region or even from South Africa, there seems to be turning of a blind eye to the situation on the ground in Zimbabwe. Do you think that South Africa needs to be more proactive in its response to what's happening? Because either way, we're having to deal with the fallout of the economic collapse of Zimbabwe.
Yeah, I think that countries like South Africa, but having said that, South Africa's got its own problems right now. I mean, maybe the time to do it was maybe 15 years ago when Thabo Mbeki was going up there with his quiet diplomacy to try to sort things out. Maybe that was the time. But then again, you've got to understand one thing that resonates very much with me with working there was that, yes, South Africa was seen as a fellow democratic nation, but on the other hand, you know, people said, well, the South Africa shouldn't tell us what to do. You know, they're not Big Brother. We're not their child. We do our own thing. So I could still see the other side of the coin and the fact that, you know, how reluctant Zimbabwe was to accept South Africa's council then. I think it's a tough one. I mean, you look at the farmers' situation I was talking about. I mean, in some ways, if the farmers accept it, if this thing goes through, I don't think it will. I don't think the government's got $3.5 billion. And even though Matuli Nubi said on CNBC Africa that it was going to be paid in US dollars, hard currency, I still don't be very doubtful about it. But secondly, I think that if something like that happened, then it may open up the country a bit more to donors and a little bit more to property, saying they can look after property rights. But again, you know, there's a lot to go through. I mean, even some of the farmers they were talking about bringing back, they're given them 99-year leases. Some of the very farmers they chased off. And some people were saying, well, you know, you can't get a bank loan on that. And then we asked about that same question to Nube, and he said, like, oh, well, we'll try and help them if we can with the banks. I mean, what kind of a security is that if you're trying to do a business?